Um, Hello, everybody. I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Laurie Heller from the psychology department right here at Carnegie Mellon. And she is our local expert on acoustics and hearing and cognition. And she has an impressive number of affiliations. She's a founding board member of the Auditory Perception and Cognition Society, an associate editor of the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. And within CMU, she's affiliated with the Department of Psychology, the Center for Neural Basis of Cognition, the CMU Neuroscience Institute, the CMU Music and Technology Program, and the Pittsburgh Cognitive Auditory Neuroscience Group. So we are in Pittsburgh a big center for auditory and hearing sciences. And we will hear about all this from Laurie Heller today in her talk on the recognition of everyday sound events. Please go ahead. And you could maybe start by saying your policy for taking questions.
Okay. Hi, thank you for that introduction. And everyone, I'm pleased to be able to participate in this LTI Colloquium series. Thank you for having me. I will pause a couple of times and ask people maybe to make a comment in the chat about something, and then we'll do unmuting with questions at the end after about an hour. Okay. So today I will be reviewing the human ability to recognize everyday sound events, and many of the issues that I bring up will have parallels with issues that arise during technological attempts to detect and classify sounds, and I hope you will find it useful to explore these connections. The outline for today. The human ability to recognize sounds is crucial for being aware of events in our surroundings. And there are some ways in which our auditory recognition system is robust and powerful, but there are other ways in which it can be malleable and fooled. So we'll begin by talking about ways to ensure that you are working with quality human data. If you're trying to make a automatic classification system, it's still only as good as the data you're putting into it. But first, I just want to take a step back and marvel at what an amazing thing it is that we do when we hear everyday sounds and are able to figure out what is causing them. So we can do much of this even with just one ear. So let's start with an analogy to one ear, a single post standing up in this lake. If you were only able to measure the level of the water on this post at each moment in time, do you think you could know that an object was passing by, such as this boat? Could you tell that it was a boat? And what about the fact that the level of the water is also influenced by all the other objects around? So it could be any new sound could be causing new waves or reflecting waves. Could you tell that there was a duck or a swimmer nearby? So it seems like a really hard problem if all you could do is look at the level of the water on this post, right? But that's essentially the problem that is posed to our ear. Sound sources emit energy, which cause variations in air pressure, and these pressure variations propagate outwards, analogous to the waves of the water in the photo. And sound waves coming from different locations will sum with each other when they reach the same location, such as our ear. And this initial sensory information that we have is the instantaneous deflection of our tympanic membrane, or eardrum, in response to air pressure. So it registers only one value at a given point in time. And we derive all meaning from sound by the precise pattern in which the amplitude of this deflection varies over time. Yet, we are able to recognize multiple sound sources in our environment with apparent ease. And this apparent ease belies the difficulty of the inferences we are making with our auditory cognitive system. This is not solved by the ear alone. It is accomplished with the help of the entire auditory system and human knowledge. So how do we find out about human sound recognition? We have to start by asking people questions. And it very much matters how you ask the question. So this is relevant to sound event classification systems because they are optimized to accurately predict human labels. And human recognition data are often used as a benchmark for sound event classification system performance. If you use a free response paradigm, for example, asking listeners something like, "What is this sound?" then the responses they give are not constrained, but there's a great deal of work on the other end for the experimenter, who must code and quantify the data consistently. For example, by deciding whether responses that use different words are nonetheless referring to the same object or sound event. So to make coding easier, you can give a forced choice question, such as, is this a truck or a cow? But the accuracy, the answers you get will be constrained by how well you've chosen your response options. And if you compare it to another study that had different response options, then you can't compare the accuracies. So another option is a rating scale, such as a scale for loudness that we see on the right here. And that's unidimensional. It gives you much richer information than just a yes-no response. But responses will be affected by its maximum value and by how willing people are to use the entire scale. Or you can use a semantic differential scale, which puts words with opposite meanings on either end of the scale. You can see that on the far left. You have an example for rating the quality of guitar sounds, which has endpoints of rough or smooth. Obviously, the semantics of these words must be agreed upon by all participants. In the middle, we see a depiction of a sorting task. And this is a task that's well suited to find out how, in an exploratory way, how people explicitly organize a large number of stimuli into concepts or sound categories. When creating a recognition test, it matters how large and diverse the set of options are. People will start to pay attention to really tiny differences between sounds if all of the sounds are very similar, yet they will overlook those same differences if the set is very large and diverse. In other words, it matters whether you give people open set or closed set responses and what they consist of. So open set tests have a listener indicate what they just heard without any context, where sort of like the free response we talked about before, whereas closed set tests have the listener choose from among a list of options. And it is well known that the open set test of word recognition consistently reveals effects on performance that traditional closed set tests do not show. In the case, so that there are factors I can actually miss, that are important and that are happening in people's perception, but you don't see when you use a closed set test. So in the case of word recognition, there are important processing variables such as lexical competition and talker variability. So now I'm talking about environmental sounds, but keep this in mind when you're looking at performance on closed set tests of environmental sounds as well. This is one of many reasons why you should never be tempted to combine estimates of recognition accuracy across different experiments. Finally, in order to have high quality data, it is going to depend on how you handle the individual differences between your raters. These would be raters that are, say, labeling sounds or something, or rating them for qualities. You're going to need to use an inter-rater agreement criterion, such as kappa or interclass correlation coefficient, and that depends on the type of rating being done. But also, you're going to have to make decisions on whether or not to normalize when people do not use the full scale. And you're going to have to decide whether the number of observations is sufficient to have the reliability that you need in order to find the effects that you want to discover. So one of the things you're going to do there is need to clean your data and remove people who aren't really sincerely responding, right? But your data cleaning practices need to report all data that were discarded and use a clear and consistent criterion. In other words, 200 people started the experiment, data from 30 were discarded. That should be reported every time that rating results are shown. And the best method for discarding data from non-compliant participants is to use catch trials. But whatever you do, find some criterion that's not related to your question of interest. You'll also want to think about the cultural context of your participants and be sure that the instructions are understood in the way that you intend them. Also, sound familiarity has a big effect on sound recognition ability. And if someone has never heard, for example, a pig squeal, then maybe that doesn't make sense to have that sound on your sound test, right? So you might want to consider whether using even a circular knob rather than a linear scale might make more sense in some contexts. The recognition accuracy that you get will also depend on the memory load of the task, which has to do with how complicated the instructions are and how many items the listeners have to juggle in memory while they're making their comparisons. It will also depend on how much information people have about what type of setting or scene they're listening to. For example, if you hear a clang and you know you're listening to a kitchen scene, that will constrain the type of events you consider. You'd be more likely to think it's a pan or something, right? And to use some lingo, people use prior probabilities when they're making these guesses. As we'll revisit later, it will depend on what you guide people to listen for, such as the source object or the sound quality. And this is yet another reason that you can't combine recognition data from different data sets. Even if the instructions were not different, the context might be. All right. We're doing okay here with resolution and sound? All right. So you've probably heard the question, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? All right. Well, in this question, it's really essential to specify that the tree falls, right? Because there needs to be an action for there to be a sound. It would be a nonsensical question to ask instead, if a tree is in a forest, does it make a sound? If a tree sways in a breeze, that's a very different type of sound. So this is what we mean by a sound event, that in order to specify it, the forces and actions and the objects are all essential. All right. We now explore the robustness of human sound recognition. Environmental sounds can be defined as all naturally occurring sounds that are neither speech nor music. That makes it a bit of a grab bag, right? It is worth noting that both human speech and human music are forms of communication, and they are robustly recognized. For example, you're all probably familiar with the fact that speech is recognized even if you remove the upper half of the signal frequencies, or conversely, the lower half of the signal frequencies. This is useful for communication, and speech is subjected to selective pressure in order to be understood by humans. On the other hand, there's no such force consistently shaping the sounds in our environment that are not communicative. So there's no force shaping them to make them better understood by humans, and there's no guarantee that we would recognize any sounds from that point of view. But of course, on the other hand, there is selective pressure for hearing to provide humans with information about their environment. And it does that. It turns out that sound recognition is rather good for common everyday sounds, even though it's not perfect for all of them. When spectral information about environmental sounds is degraded with noise, recognition accuracy remains high for many sounds. And this is especially true for sounds with a characteristic temporal pattern, such as typing at a keyboard. So to illustrate this now, I'm going to play you some examples of an environmental sound that has been degraded by being processed through a process known as vocoding. This disrupts the spectrum or frequency content of the sound, and it replaces it basically with noise, but it preserves most of its temporal characteristics. In the first example on the left, the temporal envelope of a common environmental sound has been used to modulate noise in 4 frequency channels. Although in a clinical setting, you would typically be given some options to choose from, a closed set test of like, is it this, or this sound? I'm not going to do that for you. I'll give you the open-ended question, what do you think this sound is? And I'll play it for you. Oh, now that it's like that, it's harder to play. Okay, let's go. All right. So do you recognize it? You can feel free to put in the chat what you think it is right now. All right. So now this one is the same sound modulated with, I think, 8 channels. Okay. And people are guessing. All right, and right. Okay. And now we will get to play the original sound if my computer will let me go there. Ooh, I got it. So I hope you got that it was a dog barking, and you probably got it before that last one anyway. So there we go. There's also a way in which sound events are a little bit different from speech with regard to reverberation. That is, everyone knows here, I think, that reverberation, which is echoes of the original sound, degrades speech intelligibility. And so for environmental sounds, I'll just say that there are cases in which it can actually benefit. So if you're outdoors and you hear an explosion, then hearing echoes of that original explosion or reverberation can help you to know that the sound was caused by a powerful event coming from far away. So in some cases, it can actually be a cue. That was just a point I wanted to make. All right, and now let's move to the next slide. All right. So there's evidence that our perceptual systems can merge both bottom-up information given by the acoustic stimulus and top-down information, which is given by our knowledge of the world, to infer an accurate interpretation of our sound environment on the whole, right? For the most part, we do. And in this example, I'm going to play for you a recording that I made of the sound of water being poured from a pitcher into a cup. And next, I erased the sound in 5 brief spots. So the original sound was a continuous sound of water, and then I blanked out some moments in it. See? But then over those moments, I put 5 bursts of noise. And so I'll play you this sound first with the bursts of noise going through. And what's going to happen is you should perceive water as being continuously poured through here with the pitch sort of smoothly descending regardless of the noise. This might remind you of the phonemic restoration effect if you've ever heard that with speech. All right, here we go. It's a short sound, so I'm going to play it a second time. Okay, so hopefully you heard that it sounded like the water was pouring through that noise, and the noise was kind of a separate stream of sounds coming through. So now I'll remove those 5 bursts of noise and play the remaining sound. That's really the sound with the acoustic information you heard before. And now when you play it, you'll hear gaps in the sound, and you're under no illusion that the pouring is continuous. In fact, you might even imagine that a person pouring water from a pitcher is kind of rapidly wiggling the pitcher so as to stop and start the flow of water a few times. Let's hear it. Was that loud enough? Okay. I'll play it one more time. Okay. That is the real sound signal you heard the first time as well, but when there's noise, your cognitive system is filling in the missing signal with the smoothest continuity between the parts of the signal that you can hear. And you perceive the sound of pouring water even when it's not really there. That is your top-down auditory cognition at work. Research from my lab has investigated the neural regions that are engaged when people are actively listening to sound events. While laying in an fMRI scanner, listeners heard 2 sounds and had to decide if they were the same or different. We recorded the sounds of both scraping and tapping actions performed on both metal and plastic pipes. In the action block of trials, listeners were instructed to judge whether the action performed was the same, even if the material of the object differed. For example, I'll play you the sound of a metal pipe scraping followed by the sound of a metal pipe tapping. In this case, the listener in the action block would respond different because the actions differed. Okay. In contrast, the material block of trials for that same sound, listeners would have heard it but been instructed to judge whether the material of the object was the same, regardless of the action performed. So a listener in the material block would respond same to the pair of sounds you just heard, because both of them were metal. So now for clarification, I will play a pair of sounds with different materials, metal and plastic, but the same action, tapping. And in this case, in the material block, the listener would respond different. Are there any questions about that that I should clarify in the chat before we move on?
There was a question about the last slide, I think. Ankit, would you like to unmute
Yes.
yourself?
Yeah. So in the previous slide, let's say if one is given the second sound that you had played, and one wants to recognize that that sound actually had been chopped and want to recognize the original event. Are there methods to do that?
I'm sorry. I heard the first part of your question, and then I could not. I literally just couldn't hear the second part. We probably should put that to the end of the lecture, given the audio situation. I just didn't hear what you said, so I think I will move on.
Okay, would you like to? Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
I
don't know why.
Hold questions to the end.
I think we better hold the. I will try to get back to it, but I'll try to change something on the audio. Maybe I'll put on headphones or something. But right now, I just couldn't. I can't answer your question. I couldn't hear it, and I think that we probably, given my tech issues, I should probably move on. But thank you for your question. We'll get to it. Okay. So let me tell you about the results that we've got here. But if you have a question of just like what the heck are you even talking about, like, so that you can't understand what I'm saying unless we move on, then please do ask for clarification. Okay. So I'm just going to show you some of the results from that study really briefly. If you look at the yellow regions on these cortical maps, those are the regions that were more active when participants were discriminating those real sound events you heard, in comparison to the control condition, were they just listening to some noises that had the same spectrum but not the temporal properties. So that's the yellow areas are, there's always like an auditory cortex lighting up when you hear something, right? But in fMRI, you're always comparing this sound versus that sound. Where is it more active? So that's what the yellow is showing you. So the yellow areas you see include the superior frontal gyrus in the frontal lobe and the inferior parietal sulcus in the parietal lobe. And this shows that it's much more than an auditory task. It's not just recruiting auditory specific areas in the temporal lobe, but there are multimodal areas and top-down factors contributing to performance. All right. So now we're going to talk about some of the acoustic features that we use to do everyday sound identification, and the causal information provided by sound comes in the form of acoustics. While there is no guarantee that the acoustics will be unique for every causal event, there is a causal connection between the acoustics and the event that produced it. And I will describe some classes of spectrotemporal acoustic features that have been suggested by human data and acoustic features that have been, I will describe some of these features that have been suggested by human data and acoustic analysis. And we will look at human accuracy for identifying materials, objects, and actions from sound, and we'll interpret them in this framework. So we did a behavioral study in my lab about the identification of actions and materials. We used pipes again made of 4 different materials: glass, plastic, metal, and wood, and we performed 4 actions with them: bouncing, hitting, rolling, and scraping. And so we found that listeners could almost perfectly identify the actions, as you can see in the top graph. Who's got a pointer going on here?
Ooh.
I don't know. Okay. Anyway, and then down below you can see the poorer identification in the graph showing the discrimination of materials. Okay, so people could tell metal and glass apart from wood and plastic. But if you want to know how well we can tell apart metal from glass, then you look at these white bars down below. That's also where wood versus plastic is. So that's poor identification. We notice that the identification of material is the best when you have impacts, such as bouncing and hitting over here, relative to scraping or rolling. So note that most past experiments that show good material discrimination on humans that are out there in the literature, they almost all use impacts that freely vibrate. So it'll be like the struck metal plate or something. And that's because that is when there is the most acoustic information about material, as with a freely vibrating object, when the resonance frequencies of an object are apparent. It is worth asking for these other more difficult cases where you don't have that kind of free resonance, whether machine learning will ultimately be better at classifying material than humans are. There's certainly room for improvement. In another study, we tried to relate acoustic features to the different kinds of actions that were perceived in sounds. So we gave people 68 sounds to rate, and they got a scale in which they rated how likely it was that a sound was produced by a certain action. For example, they might hear the sound of a ball rolling and be asked how likely it was that the sound was produced by rolling. But we also asked them how likely it was that the sound was produced by tapping or scraping, etc., for a total of 18 ratings per sound. This allowed us to do a multidimensional analysis to put all of the sounds into a common space based on their similarity. The dimensions underlying this space mapped onto many commonly used acoustic correlates, such as spectral centroid and modulation depth, things you're probably all very familiar with. We found 6 main clusters of sounds, and I've shown you 6 spectrograms of the sounds that were rated as the most typical sounds from each of these 6 groups. On the top left panel in A, there are tapping sounds. They have 3 broadband onsets indicated by the vertical stripes and some resonant frequencies indicated by the short horizontal stripes attached to each of them. Okay. On the top right in panel B, we have an explosion. And note that the intense broadband noise decays before there's an increase again due to reverberation. On the middle panel in panel C left, we have crumpling paper. It has a mix of noisy events with varying bandwidths and timing. On the middle right in panel D, we have scraping, which has silence between the 3 broadband scrapes. On the bottom left in panel E, we have a rolling ball, which has an emphasis on the low frequency region and shows many of the small impacts between the rough surface of the wooden ball and the board on which it's rolling. And finally, on the bottom right, panel F, we see some dripping sounds. Several of the broadband transients are followed by a frequency modulated sweep. So having established that people are sensitive to the causal physics of sounds, it is informative to consider this performance in the framework of what types of sound events are physically possible. So following Gaver's analysis, we note that with solids, there can be impacts, scraping, deformation, and rolling. Those are sort of the major classes of interactions among solids that produce sounds. With liquids, there can be dripping, pouring, splashing, and rippling. And with gases, there can be explosions, gusts, and continuous flow. A few thoughts about human labeling of sounds and sound databases and so on. I want to point out that some researchers use environmental sounds as control conditions for words, and therefore they curate a set of highly identifiable and stereotyped sounds that immediately suggest one unique name. So we had an example of that with the dog bark, right? This serves an important function for some scientific questions that can be asked about sound, carries verbal content or not, or linguistic content or not. However, as a psychologist, I'm interested in much of what humans do with everyday sounds that is not as straightforward as that. Sometimes it's not clear what caused a sound, and perhaps learning about the way that humans deal with the causal uncertainty of sounds could have value for sound event classification systems as well. Next, I'm going to tell you about some research we did in which we tried to figure out the best types of words and phrases to use to label action-oriented sounds. And believe it or not, we were asking this for a psychology reason rather than for machine learning, but I think it's relevant. So I first need to give you a little bit background as to why we even thought that that was an interesting question. It's because Eleanor Rosch did some research on the taxonomies of objects and object categories, in which she showed that there is a best type of word to use to ask about them. For example, it's easy for someone to answer you if you ask them, is a robin a bird? But if you ask someone, is a robin an animal? They'll probably get the answer right, but it will take them longer and it's more difficult. They might even make a mistake sometimes. So she took this as evidence that the term bird is at a level of a taxonomy that's privileged. It's a level that's closest to the robin, whereas the term animal is more distant. It's at a higher level in the taxonomy. So more generally, this privileged basic level term gives the most accurate and rapid responses to labeling questions. That is why we decided to ask a parallel question about whether there would also be basic level terms for labeling action sounds. I'll show you some data. We found some evidence for a basic level for describing action sounds. On the left, you see a list of recorded sounds that were described at various levels of detail with nouns, verbs, and adverbs. Many of these were what we might call action sounds, where a human is making an action with a fairly non-specific object, but the action's pretty clear. Again, like calling a robin an animal, it just kind of feels odd to label a trickling sound as the sound of liquid. People can do it, but they'll make mistakes on it. In the graph on the right, you can see in the bottom panel, which is the reaction times to these questions, that response times were the lowest when the basic level verb, such as trickling, was used. Right there, the lowest, which is called L3 here, the specific action. And up here for accuracy, you can see that it has high accuracy that really doesn't sacrifice accuracy for the fact that it's faster. So we conclude from this that there are sort of best levels for action sounds. I'm sorry, I kind of lost my place here. But we might seem on the surface to be suggesting that you just want to use a verb to label sound events from the way that these data look. And I just want to clarify, that wasn't the purpose of the study. I think it is consistently a good idea to use both nouns and verbs in general to label sound events. And that's the type of approach being taken by Bello and others in their sound event databases that they're creating. I'm providing this example of a verb taxonomy or action taxonomy to illustrate the importance of wording choices on listeners. So this particular insight might help us also understand why certain words are used preferentially by people when they are labeling sounds, right? We would predict that they would use these basic level sort of specific verbs when labeling sounds, even though there's other verbs or more detailed things that they could use. All right. Thank you for your patience on that one. I kind of lost my place. All right. No, I think I went one ahead there. Okay. Humans are flexible. And they will categorize sounds along multiple dimensions. There are many possibilities. Here we'll mention acoustical similarity and sound source similarity as having been tested. On the one hand, two sound sources that seem very different, like a cat in an ambulance, very different sources. They may actually sound a little bit similar when they're wailing. On the other hand, a doorbell and a door knock may sound on the surface very different, but they may be sometimes grouped together by people because they involve a door, which in our top-down knowledge we know is a similar source. So we can get different types of similarity judgments and categorizations depending on how we ask people and how we direct them. So I want to point out, you can't just ignore this issue and hope it goes away. It's always there. People will pick some frame of reference to answer these types of questions of similarity in particular. So you really are better off deciding what you want them to use and specifying it. And this points out why it's very important to know what the instructions were whenever you use somebody else's data. But given what we know so far, we should expect that the choice of label or dimension ought to influence their listening mindset, and this is a reason to be consistent when doing experiments and getting labels, and it's also a reason not to combine accuracy data from different experiments. Also note, people can hear events gradually varying between a category, and they can remain undecided about what category a sound source was, yet still infer some of its properties from the acoustics. So in other words, identification is not necessary for people to say, something about it. I don't know what it was, but it was something heavy being dragged, but I don't know if it was a desk or what, or a box. Okay. These are all examples of people being pretty flexible in how they think about sounds. And you can decide for yourself if that's a strength or a weakness. Oftentimes when we're trying to do experiments, it's definitely a challenge, right? There are many excellent free sound databases out there for sound events, and they all have different strengths, so I just want to point them out. One thing they almost do is commit to how they will label and organize the sounds at the top level. As one example, the Auditory Labs Sound Events database is a small database of action-oriented sounds such as rolling balls and crumpling paper. The sounds are organized by event type rather than by object types, like impacts or scraping or crumpling. It is small and specific, with its main advantage being that all sounds were recorded with the same high-quality audio equipment in a sound booth. The recording conditions are well documented, including videos. But if you're looking for, instead, over 500,000 samples of every type of sound you could possibly need, then you want to head over to Freesound. This is crowdsourcing at its best, with a large community of people uploading sounds under the Creative Commons license. Users will tag sounds with terms they choose, like water or door, and also there are packs of sounds that include categories like zombie. And no organization is imposed, so that one could search for objects or actions. But a quick look at the tags suggests that users tend toward using nouns in their tags. And as we know, just specifying the noun is not enough to specify the sound event. Contributors to Freesound are often very generous with information about the recording conditions, but that is not a requirement for an upload. And some sounds are real recordings and others are synthetic. As one example of another type of database, I'll mention the ESC50 database. It has 2,000 labeled environmental sounds organized into 50 classes, and these have been very useful for benchmarking many methods of environmental sound classification. The classes are sometimes defined by a noun, for example, dog, and sometimes they're defined and labeled as a noun and a verb, like glass breaking. Sometimes the class is organized by a single source, such as a dog, and contains vocalizations with a wide range of acoustical variation. They're not all barks, for example. So the higher level labels, such as animal sounds or interior domestic sounds that are used on this database, sometimes appeal to both sources or environments. So the point being there that it might be helpful eventually to have a consistency in that schema, but not criticizing any of those. They're great resources. So we finally got some snow, and I went out for a walk a few days ago in the new snow in Pittsburgh. And please watch carefully of this movie if it doesn't flip away because it's very quick. Here we go. Okay. Were you surprised? You can put it in the chat if you want. That was the same sound of me doing cornstarch for the whole time. And yes, that really is me walking in the snow a few days ago. That's all true. But the sound was me squeezing that box of cornstarch. And that is known as a Foley effect, which I will elaborate on. So, back in the days of live radio broadcasts, sound effects were made to accompany stories that were being performed in a studio in real time, and they had a small set of objects to work with and had to simulate the sounds of footsteps, rain, gunshots, etc. These types of sounds are called Foley effects after the man who originated many of them. And by the way, nowadays almost every environmental sound you hear in a movie or TV show is added in after the filming was done. So it's not recorded along with the dialogue. There's someone who actually has the job of watching the movie and recording themselves making all the sounds that should be there, such as the squeak of a chair or the clink of a glass, and that person is called a Foley artist. Nice job, huh? But the point is that there are some sounds that can be made by different objects or different processes that fool people regularly. It is informative to consider what properties allow these sound substitutions. As with sound event classification, there can be confusions between sounds from different causes and different categories. So many years ago, we set out to test whether Foley effects could inform us about the important features used for sound identification, and we recorded pairs of real and Foley sound events, such as breaking a glass, striking a match, or walking in mud. For example, for walking in mud, we recorded someone walking outside in mud, and we also had someone in the lab squishing a wet newspaper rhythmically with their hands. So in our experiment, we had participants listen to these recorded sounds, just the sounds, no movies, and they did a free response task to identify them. We coded this to get a quantitative accuracy score between 0 and 2 for the actions, and then separately for the materials of each sound. We are showing the data just for material identification in this graph, and we see that a couple of Foley sounds convey the material better than their real counterparts. If you look at the real and Foley pairs of striking a match, where are we here, and walking in mud, you'll see that the material identification for the Foley sound, indicated by the yellow bars, was higher than it was for the real event, indicated by the blue bars. So we used this to form a hypothesis centering just on walking in mud, and we thought that the real event had a better action of walking, while the Foley conveyed a better material of mud or water wetness. So we formed a hypothesis about how to combine the best acoustic features of each of these sounds to make a hybrid sound that was better than the real one, or that we hoped it would be, let's say. So here's how we did that. On the left, you can see a description of how we extracted the temporal features of walking from the waveform of the real recording. So here's our real version. We bandpass filtered the signal into narrower regions, and we extracted the slow-moving temporal envelope represented in the plot as a blue line. From the Foley waveform, we edited out the silences between the squishes to make one long squishing sound. And we multiplied the envelope and the edited Foley sound to produce a hybrid sound that's shown in the bottom right plot. So first I'm just going to play the Foley sound for you. I don't have time to play everything, but we'll play... Oh, I gotta move this over. Hold on. Okay, Foley sound. Okay, and it sounds wet, but it doesn't convey... wait. I think I did that, yeah. It doesn't convey footsteps very well, right? So now I'll play you the hybrid version, which is down here. And in this version, it seems that the footsteps and the wetness are both conveyed. And that's confirmed on the right with data that you see, where we conducted an experiment with brand new listeners, and they were given 2 of our sounds in a forced choice task. And they were asked which one was a more realistic example of walking in mud. In this graph, the hybrid sound is called mud apply, and the x-axis shows the proportion of times that participants preferred it. The majority of participants preferred the hybrid version over the Foley sound, and importantly, they also preferred it to the real recording. We can conclude from this example that the slow-moving temporal envelope conveys the most information about the action, whereas the fine structure in the waveform conveys the most information probably about the material. And are there any really big questions I should pause for there? I want to watch the time, but okay. Okay, good.
Hang on. Maria, was there something that you wanted to comment on?
No, just
oh, sorry, that wasn't a question.
Yeah, I was just asking for clarifications. I think
okay.
Comments we'll take later. Okay, thanks. All right, so for now we want to ask, why do Foley effects work from a scientific point of view? So traditional Foley effects don't seem to need to be acoustically identical to their real counterpart, but they seem to have the features they need to stand in for them. And why they work might be better understood by looking at these levels of description on this slide. So let's consider it. Let's consider the Foley effect of walking on snow. The first level of description, shown on the top of this slide, might describe the sensory or musical qualities of the sound of walking in snow, such as the fact that it seems noisy and periodic. Jumping down to the bottom level, we may go straight to identifying the source, and most people use this description of it if it's available to them. However, there's a middle level that I think explains why Foley effects work. In this case, cornstarch can fill in for snow because both events involve rhythmic compression of a granular substance. This level seems to express the physical interactions that produce similar acoustics between the two events. But who would describe a sound like this besides me? Well, maybe a Foley artist. Or maybe you will start to from now on. I just want to give a quick shout out to the many Foley synthesis methods out there. On the left here, I'm showing a recent paper by Ghosh and Prevost that used a GAN to make a sound that matches the actions of a movie. And there's other methods out there that are using principles of physics to generate Foley. These are really starting to close the gap between artificial sounds and real recorded ones. The dark side of all that is shown on the right. There's some voice cloning that was used in a bank heist recently. It's possible that getting too good at imitating things can have its costs. All right, now I'm going to get bold and venture into some implications for machine learning, even though I'm a psychologist, and I would like to pose some questions for you to consider. One factor to consider is that people can arrange sequences of small events into logical orders, such as buttering toast and pouring coffee, and that might imply making breakfast. That's using our top-down knowledge of the world. And this sequence could be broken into smaller events by other definitions. So the level of granularity that we're using is something to keep in mind when we're talking about identifying sounds. It will surely affect the strategy of the required approaches to sound classification and learning. And I also want to point out that in general, exciting process in sound classification is being made by leveraging other modalities for supervision, such as language, images, and video. And maybe we can take that a step further with information about actions. When machine learning is failing on a category, is there a way in which human perception or physics can help us to understand and improve performance? Given what we've reviewed today, one question I want to ask is whether we can map action classes fairly directly onto acoustics. If so, would that then be helpful to first map acoustics to actions and then subsequently map some set of actions onto various sound effects or sound events or classes? And that's the topic of the next slide. I did some collaborative work with colleagues at CMU on a classifier that actually improved its performance on classification of the ESC50 sound dataset by considering actions. Starting with a state-of-the-art DNN that was using open L3 audio embeddings, we added 20 more dimensions that described the actions and the sounds. These action dimensions were described in terms of the basic types of verbs that I've talked about, such as dripping and breaking and blowing and verbs like that. These did not by themselves identify the specific sound classes that were things like vacuum cleaner and dog and so on. We made sure they were not specific to the classes. So each sound was given a graded degree of multiple actions called an action vector, and each sound had that as a feature. And each row of this blue figure here shows an action vector for one of the 4 sound examples, and the top row is for an airplane. These columns here indicate that it was rated high on blowing, rotating, and vibrating. These are the brighter blue, right? So this ended up with one unique action vector describing each of the 2,000 sounds. It wasn't an action vector per class, it was per sound. And these are meaningful action vectors and features. They have real meaning to them. Our goal was to see if the information about that action, real meaning meaning interpretable meaning, as opposed to like some embedded level you don't know what it means, right? So our goal was to see if the information about the actions and the sounds in the ESC50 could improve automatic sound event classification. As an example, one of the baseline systems we tested was using state-of-the-art audio embeddings to perform sound event classification. That starting place was a deep neural network with 3 hidden layers, 6144 dimensions, and it used audio embeddings from the Open L3 sound classification network. It started out at 80.48% correct. Next, we stacked on top of this our 20-dimensional action vectors in this DNN. And then we found that this improved sound event classification to 88% accuracy, which was briefly state-of-the-art, very briefly. Now it's just one of the better ones. One thing I should note is that although we think that we should be able to generate these action vectors automatically, at the start of this project, we did not know how to do that, so we had humans generate those action vectors. So this is really a proof of concept to show the usefulness of action information. And also, we did experiments to show the importance of these being graded vectors. We showed it's not useful if the action vector is reduced to its single highest dimension, like just one action. So it's not just substituting as a label for the sounds. It also loses its value. It doesn't improve performance if the ratings become all or none. So we need that graded nuance. It seems that the graded multidimensional ratings of the action vectors are important and useful, and we hope to find out more about that in the future. We are excited about action vectors as interpretable features that are unique to each audio clip and seem to provide additional information. And my last little bit about machine learning here, pie in the sky. Did you ever notice that some items in a category are consistently confused? And when you're working on if you're working on a classification system or looking at them, and do you ever think that maybe there's a good reason why that happens, and maybe they shouldn't really be in the same category? If so, maybe we can begin to understand some of this by using human judgments. For example, the example I just gave you, but for example, also the same objects can undergo different actions. As we mentioned before, a door can creak or click shut or be knocked on. And the ESC50 and other data sets tend to have mixed together the multiple types of acoustic events. So for example, there's 2 types of airplanes in one class, both jet and propeller engines, which are acoustically pretty differently. And this type of mixture might be making the learning task a lot harder if we're trying to predict the sound event classes from acoustics. So for a labeled data set that's going to be used for these purposes or benchmarking, maybe we could use what we know to provide a more objective way to create or even clean up database categories before we set our classification systems to try to learn from them. Anyway, just some thoughts wild thoughts I wanted to put out there at the end of my talk. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I would like to thank members of the auditory lab and colleagues at CMU who contributed to the research I've discussed, and I look forward to speaking with people on Zoom after this talk. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll clap for everybody.
Now I'm going to look at the chat.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now, yes.
Yeah. Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, unless, yeah, there was already a question in the chat. Can you look at the chat and share at the same time? Or if you need to stop sharing.
Maybe I'll leave it on in case somebody wants me to go to a slide.
Yeah.
But I'm going to do something right now. I'm going to try to plug in some headphones because I'm just having a really hard time hearing you. Let's see if this works.
Okay. Roshan, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Can Laurie hear? Or,
Yeah, can you hear?
Hang on. Try it again. Try it again.
Can you hear now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Awesome.
Okay.
So it was pretty interesting that you talked about the grading as an additional feature. So could you sort of explain how you came up with the scheme and how it's applied to samples?
How it's applied to the
How
to the
it's
sound?
applied to the data? Yeah, like
Yeah.
how do you figure out what the grade is? Yeah.
So we came up with the grading the graded ratings of actions based on prior data, just psychological data I've collected on people's, figuring out, oh, what's happening in this sound. And I discovered that people really have a graded sense of it could be bouncing maybe, but I think it's more likely, tapping or something. So people can kind of hold in their head multiple possible actions that could have caused the same sound, and that's probably in the acoustics, right? That the acoustics is actually ambiguous about that. So when we did this then for the purposes of acoustic information for features of the sounds, we got humans who didn't know what the sounds were to just rate a whole bunch of different verbs, or that were actions, a whole bunch of candidate actions. So it was a massive task done on mTurk that no one person did. And so for each sound, they would say, how likely is it that this was produced by rolling? And then they would rate it 1 to 5 or whatever. And then how likely is the same sound was produced by breaking? And so on. They asked many questions like that about the same sound. So then we get that vector that's got this graded information and about sort of what kinds of actions are conveyed by each individual sound. So then each individual sound has that as a feature, or a 20-dimensional feature, which is not a very high-dimensional feature for machine learning. But anyway, so does that answer your question? As that was Roshan?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, and other questions? If I'm going to look at the chat, but if anyone wants to unmute, go ahead. There was one question I couldn't hear earlier, so I'm trying to find that. If one has to correct the event occurring, how can one recognize that the audio was chopped?
So this was in relation to the audio, the pouring, where
The pouring water.
actually it was chopped. So and I mean, we will get an incorrect inference from that recording, right? If we just listen to that recording, is there a way or some mechanisms that can correct that?
Are there algorithms that can correct for the fact that it was chopped?
Yes. Because this could really happen in any kind of recording, and I mean, people might be still getting it incorrect. So are there?
So you're talking about the one where it's really zeroed out, right? Because I just went into
Yes.
Audacity and was like, blam, 0 for a little period of time, and you're saying like, okay, their original event was continuous. Something happened to the recording, and now I'm dealing with this imperfect recording. Can I make some sort of inference that it was interrupted using acoustics or something else?
Yes, and I mean, this could I mean, if there's a method that exists, this could also be potentially be used to recognize whether an audio is genuine or fake.
Yes, and I do think that it would be fantastic if any of this was useful for that purpose, exactly, to see if there was a manipulation. I'll just say that's a really interesting idea. I think there would be ways, but that wasn't the purpose of my demonstration, I haven't done that. I haven't applied that idea, but I would love to. Other questions?
Thank you.
While the students are thinking, I have a really crazy question about Foley effects. Is it possible that we've been trained by watching movies to think that fake sounds are real?
Yeah, that's especially true with gunshots. I've at least I've read the story that you know, some movies tried to use actual gunshot sounds, and it was not accepted by the audience because they were so used to you know, the boosted up ones that had been used in movies. And of course, even with the sound of snow, you know, someone who grew up where there was no snow might only know what it sounds like from movies. So you have to think about that.
Yeah, that is pretty funny.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say more about the categories, about when you were talking about Eleanor Roche. Could you say more about, maybe you could show that slide again for what are the best categories?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of it was a lot of talking and not a lot of information about the original experiment. But there's a famous paper by Eleanor Roche on this, which was dealing with objects, and it was much more visually oriented, right? It didn't have to do with sounds. But so the categories were taxonomies of things like animal, furniture, you know, things, taxonomies like that, and the idea that we use this knowledge about taxonomies in the world to that our knowledge about that can be revealed by the types of words we use most fluidly, you know, to describe objects. So what were some of the other objects? I remember animals and furniture. I'm blanking on the other ones, but there were others
I'm
too.
wondering, because a picture that I use in class, some people just saw it a few days ago. So if you ask someone, is an ostrich an animal, will they answer faster than is a robin an animal? Because an ostrich is less typical as a bird.
There's actually data on that. So I'm hesitant to guess because I would say let's go find that data, but in theory, like a robin being a typical bird gives it the best advantage of being at the basic level. Ostrich is not going to benefit from the basic level as much. So you'll find a more equivalence. That's my prediction. Now I'll have to go look up the data and see if I was wrong, because I know there's data actually out there to prove me right or wrong. But the prediction would be that the ostrich's reaction time for the basic level and higher level would be closer together than it would be for a robin, because it's atypical. It's not benefiting from that speed benefit.
That's interesting. So could I see the next slide where you had the categories of sounds?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this is the one that we're arguing is kind of basic-ish. It's not as extreme as, you know, what they find with furniture and animals. But the idea was that you could be, you want to use the most specific action verb. You don't want to just say, you know, oh, it's just liquid or it's just splashing or something. It's better to use like spattering or sloshing or something. Is actually better in terms of reaction time. And the point is, when you're faster, oftentimes there's a speed accuracy trade-off. So if you're faster, you're also less accurate. But in this case, they're faster, but it's actually one of the more accurate. This and this are the most accurate, you know. So that's why we argued for that being the case. And I think the point for more generally, in this case, it was specifically, like I said, it's just an action verb. And when we added in the the noun, it didn't, it actually just took a little bit longer, but, you know, was still perfectly accurate. So I would definitely argue that using the noun is a good idea, because people aren't doing these things in speeded conditions in most realistic applications. But it still reveals something about our underlying representations. If we're faster in one condition than another, it means they're going through less links in between.
Yeah.
I have a question here.
Oh,
Hi.
Jong, are you asking a question?
Yes, I want to ask a question actually concerning just what you asked actually. I was actually very curious about this real sound and then the fake sound. Like Laurie was saying something about the gunshot and also the snow. And I'm just wondering whether if people pay like a close attention to it, is it possible that people can still tell the real sound? And what typically make the real sound stand out from the fake ones?
So you're asking about Foley effects, and can people tell the real sound apart from the fake one? Like if you ask them to just discriminate, and if you just said, can you tell them apart at all? Are they the same or different? Can people tell? Is that part of the question?
The question is not whether people can tell, it's how to tell. Like
how can they tell?
Yes, how to train people to tell like what is real and what is not. And is there a way, or is there no way for people to do this? And maybe, and I'm also thinking along the line that maybe there are 99% of the people like who are not trained to do this. They may not be able to do it. But how about that 1% who are actually willing to learn? And how should they start learning to tell the real sound from the fake ones?
In general, yeah. Okay, so I guess we could say there's two kinds of Foley effects. One of them is such a good substitute that like acoustically you can't even tell them apart, and then no person can tell if it's not acoustically different, right? But then there's the kind that work perfectly well to substitute, but you can tell them apart. So with the cornstarch, if I go back and if I were to play you the original recording, the sound recording of my footsteps in the snow, I can listen to them side by side and they sound very different. But when I put the plausible cornstarch in at the right timing with my footsteps, I'm fooled too. I'm like, that kind of sounds right. But if you just played the audio, like I wouldn't have any trouble telling them apart. It's not that they couldn't be different. It's that they have to have like kind of the right features of impacts at the right time and the right kind of rhythmic compression of a granular substance. So if you wanted to say like, if I looked at that, how could I tell that that was a Foley? How could I tell if that was the real or original? I mean, we know things like there should have been some background noise if it was outside and there wasn't any. There's there's like things like that you could use given a specific context. So I don't know if that's the kind of thing you're asking about, is like what cues could people look for to sort of tell with their ears if something's fake or real. But there are people out there looking at things, in more levels of detail about acoustics, and there's ways to tell that there's been acoustic manipulation. If you're talking about a manipulation of an original sound, but I don't think that's what you were saying. You're talking about like, how do you tell if this is a Foley or a real? Sometimes I would say sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can tell them apart, but you don't care. It works for you. And that's because it has the right features. So.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. I grew up in Singapore. There's all summer, no snow.
Yeah.
So the real snow, like it was so different for me, and I appreciate it. Appreciate the real one, not the fake one. So,
yes. Got it.
Yep.
Yeah. I have experienced, this is just an off-the-cuff comment, but I have experienced, because I run around recording things all the time, a lot of disappointment trying to record sounds that sound so clearly like something when I'm there, and then I go back and I listen to the recording and I think, it doesn't sound convincing at all. But when I was there and in that situation and saw what was happening, it was very clear. It was a great sound of a ball rolling or something, but then you go and you listen to it and you're like, wow, that doesn't sound like a ball rolling at all. That's really hard. Some things are really hard to record for that reason. And I think that's where Foley artists punch things up in movies to make them more convincing. And then you say, what do you mean by convincing? Like that has the right kind of features that people are expecting.
So are you saying that the real sound are typically more subtle than the more convincing sound?
This is an off the cuff, like anecdotal, that sometimes the real sounds, just divorced from their context, aren't as easy to identify as you would hope. And that's just, I can just say that factually from experience and anecdote. But from talking to Foley artists, again, anecdotal, I don't have scientific data on Foley artists, but I've talked to them, and they say that they get in that situation sometimes and they punch it up with various special effects and manipulations. If it doesn't seem like if it doesn't sound big enough, they punch up the low end to make it sound bigger. There's little tricks of the trade.
Yes, thank you so much. This is so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Any other questions? We just saw in the chat that Maria, who is from some cold place in Russia, has more distinctions about the sound of snow, of walking in snow.
Yes.
But I don't see any other questions. And, Jeremiah has a question.
Oh yeah, I can ask. I was wondering if there are studies that explore the interaction of visual stimulus
with the sound. Yeah, there are some. Some are published, some I'm currently doing. And yeah, it's an active area of research.
Mm-hmm.
If you're interested, reach out to me after.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So this is in regards to your slide on the action vectors research work. So for the action vectors, I mean, so in general, from what I understand, is that the action vectors are useful in order to represent represent a given sound event when there is a sequence of I mean, we are describing it by more than one action vector. Is that what it implies? Or I mean, why would actions be useful towards describing these sound events?
Yeah, why would they be? Right.
Right.
I would say that, I would say my talk is supposed to convince you why they would be, but yes, I understand. So here's your typical sequence on the bottom left of sound event classification systems, that they would take audio, compute audio features, and try to identify it and say, oh, that was a helicopter, right? I'm sorry, this is, ignore that, that's not me right now. Okay, and then what we inserted into this was this additional loop of you take the audio and you identify actions, and in our case it was via crowdsourcing, but ultimately we'd like to identify it with something more automated. But now we have like a 20 level description of each sound, like a 20-dimensional description of each sound's actions, and we put that into our SEC system as well. We combine this and that and do better at identifying the sound classes, putting individual sounds into the correct classes. And you're saying, like, why would that help? And the answer is that is related to what I put in sort of my suggestions, is that I think sometimes there are actions that are that can help put two acoustically different things into the right class, where their acoustics are not enough to put them in the right class, but the actions kind of help with that. And like I said, with our experiments that we did, it wasn't enough to just say, oh, airplane, well, we'll call that blowing, and we'll just give every sound like a verb, one verb. That doesn't help. It doesn't improve performance. So it's the graded information about the fact that this sound kind of has a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that, like that grading, the multidimensionality is the fact that there's 20, and then the grading is the different colors. Both of those seem to be essential. Why are they? I think because that's how the acoustics is conveying actions in the world. Like we said, there's not a guarantee that there's a one-to-one mapping between this acoustic feature and this event. It's not. And there's no guarantee that it would be, right? So our job is, there's not a one-to-one mapping. What are we going to do? And we're actually able to hold multiple possible causes in our head at the same time for a sound. And that's what we ought to do when we're trying to get features of acoustics as well, so that we can say this could have been blowing, this could have been rotating, or it can be both. And what classes have those actions? Now I have a sound and it has this pattern. What classes have a pattern like that? It gives you a much richer representation than just saying one verb.
So does this imply that the 20 action vector that you have selected in this particular case would need to be somehow be at least correlated to any of the event that we are taking, or when this matrix gets generated, it automatically learns that correlation, and you are able to decode that through the pipeline? Or I'm just trying to understand whether that correlation is an important assumption in this experiment, or and if this number of actions scale up, would the experiment still hold? Like, would the conclusion of the paper still hold?
Would this scale up to like other databases and stuff? Is
to a larger dimensional vector. I mean, so I
would
consider
it scale up? Yeah, those are good questions. I do not have the answer to that, to whether it scales up to other databases or larger dimensions. I do not know, but that would be interesting to do. But your first question was about correlations, and I'm not sure what you were correlating to what, but the action vectors were completely independent step. People just heard sounds and said what actions they thought they heard in them, and they weren't tuned in any way to what the class was, and they were specifically chosen not to overlap as like one-to-one mapping with a class. Like I'm trying to think. So like we didn't use barking. If it was dog barking, we wouldn't have used the verb barking as something we rated, right? Because that would just like put it right in the class. So we made sure that they weren't.
That's what I wanted.
Yeah, we made sure we didn't do that, and because otherwise you're just like substituting one label with another. And no, we were trying to be acoustic features, action features, and not labels. That was our goal anyway. You can argue, but that was the idea.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I know we've gone over time here, and I love the questions, but.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today, and I hope that maybe this starts some more interactions between the two sides of campus. So thank you so much. I'll clap for everybody.